There was a moment in the studio when Keith Richards had simply had enough. It wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't drama. It was the sound of a line being crossed, one that could not be walked back. This wasn't the early 60s when the Rolling Stones were hungry and united. This was the mid-1970s when their fame had mutated into chaos. When the drugs weren't just recreational, they were part of the schedule. And when musical genius often collided with ego, paranoia, and betrayal. The studio, once a place of creation, had turned into a battlefield. And for Keith Richards, the song that finally pushed him out the door wasn't just bad, it was unforgivable. He didn't slam the door, but he might as well have. The tension had been building for months. Mick Jagger, now obsessed with disco and funk, had started steering the band in a direction that felt completely foreign to Keith's vision. The swaggering blues-infused rock that had defined their early years was fading fast. And in its place, shiny grooves, dance beats, and a sound that seemed to belong more to Studio 54 than to exile on Main Street. The song at the center of it all was recorded during the sessions for the album Black and Blue, a record marked by instability and rotating guitarists. Mick Taylor was gone, Ronnie Wood wasn't official yet, and the band was auditioning replacements mid-recording. That alone turned the sessions into a revolving door of uncertainty. But the real fracture came not from the lineup, but from the sound. Mick had brought in a track that was glossy, mechanical, and drenched in studio production. To Keith, it felt like an insult. It was the antithesis of what the Stones were supposed to be. He was watching his band morph into something he didn't recognize. And while the others were caught up in the buzz of a potential hit, Keith could barely sit through a playback without his blood pressure rising. He tried to bite his tongue, at first. But Keith Richards wasn't the kind of man to play along quietly when the soul of the band was at stake. Keith Richards wasn't just angry, he was disgusted. It happened during one of the most turbulent periods in the Rolling Stones' history, an era marked by drug busts, internal betrayal, musical disagreements, and a clash of egos that nearly split the band apart for good. And in the eye of that storm stood one song. One track so polarizing, so off course from the band's identity, it pushed Keith Richards to the edge. He didn't just object, he walked out. The tension had been brewing for years. By the early 1970s, the Rolling Stones were no longer just a rock band. They were a global enterprise. And with that fame came consequences. Brian Jones was long gone, found dead in a swimming pool in 1969, and Mick Taylor's entry brought a new layer of virtuosity and pressure. The creative power struggle between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was intensifying. They were no longer aligned in vision, not even close. Keith wanted grit, raw guitars, bluesy riffs, no-nonsense rock and roll. Mick wanted to experiment with disco, funk, jazz, and anything that could push the band into new commercial territory. The divergence wasn't subtle. It played out in the studio, track by track, album by album. By the time the band began working on their 1976 album Black and Blue, the friction was unbearable. The album was already shaping up to be a melting pot of genres, reggae, funk, jazz fusion, none of which were part of the Stones' foundation. Keith felt like a guest in his own band. The sessions were chaotic, filled with tension and drugs, and the band was auditioning guitarists to replace Mick Taylor, who had suddenly left the band without warning. Then came the song. It was called Cherry Oh Baby, a reggae cover. Mick was enthusiastic about it, claiming it would showcase the band's evolution. Keith was furious. To him, it wasn't just a weak track. It was a betrayal. The Rolling Stones didn't do reggae. Not like this. Keith knew reggae inside out. He had lived it in Jamaica, understood its soul. What they were recording felt like parody. During one heated session, Keith voiced his frustration, but it didn't stop the process. Mick pushed forward. The band played on. Keith got up, unplugged his guitar, and walked out. It wasn't theatrical, it was final. The air was thick with silence after he left. For the first time in years, the band was seriously questioning whether Keith was coming back. Ronnie Wood, still unofficial at the time, watched the whole thing unfold in disbelief. Studio engineers exchanged nervous glances. Mick didn't say a word. Keith disappeared for days. He went into hiding, refusing to answer calls, refusing to engage. For Keith, it was never just about the song. It was about integrity, identity, and the feeling that the band he helped build was slipping through his fingers. Eventually, he returned, but things had shifted. The band kept Cherry O Baby on the album. Keith played his parts, reluctantly. But from that moment forward, something had cracked in his dynamic with Mick. The control Mick wielded in the studio became a point of no return. What followed was a Cold War. Keith began taking more time away. His heroin addiction worsened. Mick assumed more leadership, and the band leaned further into commercial experimentation, culminating in disco-infused tracks that Keith outright refused to promote. During the Some Girls and Emotional Rescue era, Keith was often absent from promotional material, photo shoots, and sometimes even recording sessions. But it all traced back to that moment in the studio. One song, one decision, one walkout. Keith Richards may not have dismantled the Stones that day, but he made it clear. There were lines he wouldn't allow the band to cross without a fight. And even decades later, Cherry O Baby remains a symbol, not of musical evolution, but of a battle for the soul of the Rolling Stones.